Yes, I am a lawyer in private practice, and this is yet another audience where I have to overcome that, and I will do my best. Some years ago, I served on a Defense Science Board panel for the cyber supply chain study, and this was one where we got some ideas of how adversaries might infiltrate and attempt to distort or harm supply chain for electronic parts. And for a time, brief time, I was a special government employee, and I gave programs about the DSB study, some classified, some not. And there, I had to convince, uniformed people, Defense Department employees, people from the IC, engineers, that they should even listen to a word, because what the hell is a lawyer talking about this kind of stuff? But I did persevere. I am still a consultant to the Mitre Corporation. Just for curiosity, how many of you have heard of DELIVER Uncompromised? How many have read it and keep it close to you as a Bible of, okay. So DELIVER Uncompromised essentially said something that helps explain CMMC. It said that this idea of self-attestation as to your security was A, working great and all was fine, or B, not working and we had no idea who was secure or not. How many of you picked B? Everyone, please. Thank you. And so we said, gee, we need to have something called a security integrity score. And we need to create some third-party organization to go out there and look at people who claim that they should be defense contractors to see whether, in fact, they are secure. Well, little did we know that this idea, among others, would come to participate in the formation of CMMC and eventually be blamed by everyone outside this room for all of the work that they have to hire you to do to help them comply. I want to start with that because one of the things I learned on the DSP panel and in doing that project for Mitre and several others is just how important this effort is. And we talk a lot about confidentiality, and we talk about CUI, a phrase that I hate. We talk about it because DoD's whole purpose in the CMMC regulation, now and to come, is to protect the confidentiality of information. And the principal reason that it does so is because of threats from adversaries who typically are nation states. And as Mr. De La Rosa said a few minutes ago, there's a rather long gestation to all this. Well, those purposes remain valid, but there have been a few changes between the start of all this and today. And that's what I'm going to try to talk about in this, what is an all-new presentation. There are just a few bullets that existed before 2 in the morning when I finish this. And so, there could be a few rough edges here, but I'm going to try to kind of weave together some themes. So the thesis of this basically is some stuff that you know. CMMC is a compliance requirement, and it relies upon assessment. And my view is that, in fact, it does have a relationship to the DFARS 7012 clause. And, of course, CMMC is to cause you not only to satisfy the 110 requirements of SB 800-171, but also to assess and assure that you have done so. Well, I put on some dates here, which are also up on an earlier chart. 7012 came around in August of 2015, and there was actually a predecessor using a selection of 853 from 2013. And NIST 800-171, for all the frustration that it has caused so many of us, first was published in 2015. It's about 7 long years since then. Now, have things gotten simpler? No. Has industry become fantastically more secure, such that we are an asset of vanishing utility? No. So in the DSB, there is an equation that's used to assess risk. And risk is sometimes said to be a function of threat and vulnerabilities and impact or consequences. All of you know enough to appreciate that since 2015, threats have changed. Those that are from nation states are more persistent, more aggressive, more clever, more insidious, better built. And they have purposes different than they might have a few years ago. In addition to nation state threat actors, now we have ransomware, which are criminals who are seeking to extort money from you or take your information and steal it. They might be tolerated by nation states. They could even be nation states, but often they are criminals. This is a class of threat actor that we weren't worrying much about. So Wayne, I'm just picking on you for a reason. Were you worried about ransomware 3 years ago? No. How about a year ago? Yes. How about now? Big yes. And then impact. So, you all remember when NotPetya happened in 2017. This was a self-perpetuating form of malware that seemed to spread everywhere. Now, do we think that Russia actually intended that to happen? No. But then we had something called SolarWinds. And that was a form of malware introduced in a software build of a so-called trusted third party that was spread deliberately and by design to many places, including many agencies of the government. That was, or should be, a wake-up call to everyone. But just to make sure that we got the point that threats have changed and new forms of vulnerability emerge, we had a number of other things happen in the last 18 months. Log4j, Hafnium, Kaseya, Microsoft Exchange Server. And we see that there are combinations of both nation-state actors, the various APT groups from China and Russia, as well as criminals of varying degrees of sophistication, and then others who just wanted to jump on a vulnerability. So the threat has changed. There are new forms of vulnerability. And what about impact? Well, how many of you live on the East Coast and had a personal impact from the Colonial Pipeline breach? Morale, not as many as I thought. How many were you had trouble getting meat when, I'm forgetting the name of the meat company. Somebody must know. JB, meat packing was, okay. So, what we've seen and then of course, ransomware attacks have been a special problem for state and local institutions, many forms of medical providers, and like. So we have changes in threat, changes in vulnerability, new impacts. Now, has DoD's regulatory scheme changed to reflect that evolution? No. I mean, its primary interest remains in keeping CUI confidential, and that's important. But industry has some additional interest, and they are aligned because you want to keep information confidential, both for regulatory purposes and otherwise. But industry needs to be thinking about protection of enterprise value, and ransomware is a threat that could destroy the value of your enterprise. And industry wants to be concerned about continuity of operations, and you want to be a reliable participant in the supply chain of the government or your higher tier contractor. And there are new types of threats that can put that in danger. And then, as many of you know, if you are the victim of a ransomware or other cyber attack, there can be enormous liabilities of a first-party type that is costs that you incur and to third parties. So I mention all of these things because, in a sense, all of you are agents of change. Your focus primarily, of course, is on CMMC and compliance. What I'm hoping to do in this program is to find a way to bring together those capabilities and the opportunities and need to help industry protect against these other forms of risk, other threats, new vulnerabilities, different impacts. And we're going to focus on ransomware and insurance. So let's talk about timing. We have an ecosystem or an architecture for CMMC, or maybe it's just a giant bubble and we are all within it. Well, the CMMC rule is what first came out, in September of 2019? I think that's right. And here we are in July of 2022, expecting that perhaps the 2.0 rules will be published in March of 2023 and final in May. So maybe we'll start to see these requirements show up in RFIs or RFPs then. There's been there's talk by government officials that there could be a further delay in the rules because of OMB requirements. I want to stop right there because it's been a very long journey to get these rules actually in place. And when they do come in place, they don't actually impose an obligation upon you until they show up in your RFI or RFP. And that is not going to happen all at once. How many C3PAOs are there now? Anybody know? I think the last I checked, 20, 21, about that. So, we're talking about 70 or 80,000 companies that are going to need a level 2, that will be subject to level 2, many of whom will require certification. Well, unless the body of C3PAOs grows a lot, DoD is going to have to manage pretty carefully the rollout of CMMC requirements so that the demand for assessment does not exceed the supply. And what this means is that many of the companies that you are working for or hope to work for are not actually going to see a CMMC requirement for an assessment and a certification for a long time. And you all hear about this. We all worry about this gap. We've all heard endlessly people saying in one form or another, call me later, I'll deal with it when I have to, when it's in the RFP, when I must. And we all say back to them the same thing. If you believe that you can get this all done in the 6 months between the RFI or RFP and when the certification is due, you are mistaken. But some people will take the risk. Well, part of what I'm going to try to do today, and I better get to the main part pretty soon, is to show you reasons to show them why there are other things that are threats right now that they need to act upon. Because I'm urging you to think about ways to integrate into your CMMC compliance consulting and advice means to help companies keep insurance or get decent coverage, and make themselves more robust and resistant to ransomware and improve their resilience and ability to recover from it. Now, those are clear and present threats right now. And we also have to remember this, a very important point sometimes lost in the shuffle. CMMC was never intended to deal with nation-state threats. There are 2 or 3 principal APT actors that are responsible for SolarWinds or hafnium and the like. It's fine to accept that CMMC today doesn't really do so much to help against those threats, but really, we want to be looking forward, beyond the minimal limits of 171 to ways where over time, we can actually do a better job protecting the whole of the defense industrial base against the more sophisticated threats. We simply can't concede that CMMC or NIST 800-171 just doesn't get to APTs, and only a few companies that are subject to 172 should protect themselves. So there's something of a continuum here. And maybe I'm dreaming, but my hope is that we can see CMMC as a kind of near to midterm compliance requirement, but that we can be working now on protection against ransomware and the means of cyber hygiene to retain insurance. And I'm hopeful that as those things come together, we'll actually do a better job to protect against APTs. So here is the theory. I see a relationship among cyber insurance, what you have to do to get it or to keep it, CMMC compliance, which I see as something following in time, which will draw upon some of the same measures, and ransomware defenses. And in fact, if I were to take a time-phased approach to the problem, I would say that the first thing to focus on for every company that you're consulting with are ransomware defenses to make your networks and systems more robust and resilient. And the second thing, closely related to and following from the first, is to take the measures necessary to keep cyber insurance if you've got it, to get it if you don't, and to get adequate coverage that's affordable if you can. In other words, if you take those measures to protect against ransomware, you are more likely to get and keep cyber insurance, and that will mean, I think, that you are well positioned to build from that to CMMC compliance. Now, I know most of you are thinking about this in the reverse. You're thinking, well, our job is to sell and help with CMMC compliance. We're worried about those 110 requirements. We want to do them first. Well, great. But in the meantime, your clients are exposed. You can't help them. They will not get insurance unless they do a better job with hygiene, and they should have it. And then with that base of the first three, I'm hopeful that we can all improve our security, continuously improve it, to do a better job against nation-state threats, as we must. Now, compared to when CMMC 1.0 came out, how are things in the world in terms of geopolitical plasticity? Well, they're actually not good. I mean, the world that we live in now is more dangerous than it was just a couple of years ago. And we should never forget that beyond, getting that assessment done and the certification at hand, the real point here, as was mentioned by Colonel earlier, is to protect critical information important to the Department of Defense. And that's why there's sort of never an endpoint of sufficiency. Right, so I've got a couple of slides on the plague of ransomware. Well, it really is that. All right, here's an interjection. So in last October, I was hired by Mitre for another consulting project. And this one was for civilian agencies. It was the first project I've done for civilian agencies. And it involves ransomware, digital asset crimes, and insurance. And as I started the project, I came to realize that the cyber insurance market was in some trouble because of ransomware. For some number of years, and there are some insurance experts in the front row who may correct me if I'm wrong, for some number of years, cyber insurance was a great opportunity to get premiums that would be in excess of payments or claims paid. And so it looked like a very profitable business. And then 2017 and NotPetya happened. And all of a sudden, people who wrote cyber insurance without any actuarial basis to do so found that their losses, liabilities, and demands for payment exceeded what they were getting in premiums. Well, this is not surprising, but it has made it very difficult to get insurance or to keep it, and it's made it very expensive. So there are a number of studies that have been out the last couple of years, and I picked 3, I think, here, and there are more, which talk about ransomware and its impacts upon cyber insurance. So this one is from the Net Diligence report. And it says the average ransom demand has increased from 25,000 in 2017 to 751,000 in 2021. And this is fascinating. These demands have increased to the point that there is sometimes insufficient capacity in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency exchanges to meet ransom demand. Wow. Now, that's before the precipitous fall of Bitcoin and the like. So, we live in a world of great dynamics. Cryptocurrency, digital assets, were the means by which ransomware actors sought to be paid because of their supposed anonymity, untraceability, and ability to evade law enforcement. None of those things are actually quite true, as they are learning, but that hasn't stopped ransomware actors. Because to get ahead of the game a little bit, most of you think about ransomware as something where people are going to say, I'm locking your system, I'm going to exclude it from you, and unless you pay my ransom, I'm not going to give you the key to open it up. That's true. But increasingly, ransomware actors are doing that and stealing your data. And they promise to give it back to you, which they may or may not. And sometimes they are not bothering to lock your system or even to make a ransomware demand. They're just stealing your data and offering it on the dark web. Now, those of you who are thinking about obligations to third parties or legally are going to say, uh-oh, if I'm subject to a ransomware attack and my data is exfiltrated, not only is the CUI at risk, but I could have personal payment card information or health information or personally identifiable information which has suddenly been extracted from me without my authorization, which I don't know who it is being sold to, but I'm going to have to give notification to everybody and their brother whose rights in privacy or data may have been affected. And so, there is like a cascade of ramifications if you're subject to any ransomware attack. At the very least, you want to have access to your system, but you're also exposed for the possibility that data that's important to your customers, your clients, your employees, to the government could be compromised. So on the right side here, this says that since January 21, the situation with ransomware has continued to get worse. Premiums continue to increase. Loss ratios have continued to degrade. And now there's this active warfare taking place between Russia and other nations, including Ukraine. Ransomware is one of the tools of hostile nation-state activity. So this is another report from Verizon. And it says, so how many of you, everybody here knows the triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And CMMC is largely about confidentiality. But what this says is that 38% of ransomware cases have some confidentiality compromise, and then they also affect availability. When a ransomware is triggered, the organization experiences availability loss since they can no longer access their data. Well, if that happens, how reliable are you in the supply chain for program X or project Y? Not very. So let's suppose, hypothetically, that you have perfect compliance with CMMC. Suppose the DIBCAC has come out and done a high assessment and you got 100, good for you. If you nonetheless are subject to a ransomware attack and your system becomes unavailable for a week or 10 days, and then it takes you another 10 days to recover to become operable, what's that doing to the prime contractors that depend on you, or to the government for whom you are an essential participant in the supply chain? Now, there's also an interesting thing on the right side here, which I'm not sure I can see in size enough. Yeah, there it goes. So this is supply chain attacks. These are the examples of the vulnerabilities and threat actors and vectors that we didn't see. One of the greatest fears for insurers, as well as for governments, as well as for companies, is that, as it is illustrated by Kaseya, well, that's a good one, is that someone will be able to attack a widely used software or supply chain participant and proliferate malware across many entities so that they are all impacted and injured at once. And if that were to produce hundreds of insurance claims for the same cause, there could be a lot of bad problems, one of which could even be insufficient solvency of the insurance carriers. And the insurance carriers are clearly getting smarter, because now they are starting to write in specific exclusions for those kinds of contingencies. And in fact, those of you, if you haven't taken a look at recent underwriting standards or contemporary practices for cyber insurance, you should, because it's an education. So here is another one on the plague. This one says that CrowdStrike found an 82% increase in ransomware-related data leaks. And it says that another major development was increased data theft and extortion without the use of ransomware, leading to the establishment of new marketplaces, dark web, dedicated to advertising and selling victim data. Let's go back to what DoD wants you to do in CMMC. It wants you to keep data confidential. And I'm making this point perhaps to excess, but there's a whole list of ransomware actors, often from bad places, who very much want to exfiltrate your data, not for the same purposes perhaps as the Chinese, but with the same implications, I think, to DoD, and certainly the same implications to your organization insofar as its integrity, compliance, and the assurance it presents to your customers. So ransomware and the DIB. Well, we were dealing with a class of threat actors before, primarily nation states. Now we're dealing with some different actors, and this aggravates the risk to the enterprise if you are porous and not well protected against such attacks. As I've said, DFAR 7012 doesn't focus on integrity or availability, but those things are put at risk through ransomware attacks. And you're dealing with a different class of actor in the criminal ransomware enterprise. I've said that ransomware attacks may delay, disrupt, render more expensive, or prevent altogether the ability to perform a government contract at any level. And an attack with system exclusion and or information exfiltration can compromise the IP of your supply chain as well as government or customer controlled technical information, CUI. I'll go back to this first, organizing principle. When you talk to your prospective clients, you want to be informing them, educating them, convincing them that they need your help now so that they can protect against these types of real-world present threats, so that the harms that CMMC seeks to avoid are not achieved by other actors before CMMC comes to be a requirement in their contract. Now, this is a really interesting slide. This is from Marsh, one of the big insurers. And it says something that all of you will experience if you have not already. The adoption of certain controls has now become a minimum requirement of insurers with organizations' potential insurability on the line. And what you see, sometimes in elaborate complexity, is that insurance carriers now are not just asking you to fill out a questionnaire. They are sometimes providing questionnaires of extraordinary complication, and some of them are doing their own monitoring and giving you the reports of their monitoring as conditions for your receiving coverage. I have a client that received this particular report not too long ago, and it said, security summary, critical issues must be resolved to bind. Close all exposed remote desktop ports to prevent ransomware. And then another group was, may impact premium or terms. Implement a secure email gateway to protect against email-based attacks. Implement MFA at all sensitive access points to prevent ransomware. Implement MFA on VPN to prevent actionware. And then there were actions recommended that included update the Log4 library. Well, this is what companies that you hope to serve or your companies are going to see. There's been too many losses on cyber insurance written without due attention to the risks that are presented to the carrier. And so now, as the carriers get smarter and tougher, they still don't have great actuarial data to inform them on what their losses will be. But they sure can get smart and are getting smarter of what to expect from those who they will insure. And what are they driving you towards? These protection measures. And they are the ones that you might think of as doing first. And I sort of like to get your impression as we go. This is a test. So there are 12 measures that Marsh recommends. The first one is multi-factor authentication. Everybody raise your hand if you agree that that is in 171. Of course it is. The next one is email filtering and web security. In 171? No, not so much. Secure, encrypted, and tested backups. Yes. Yes. Raise your hand if you think yes. No, that's not too many either. Privileged, secure, encrypted, and tested backups. Privileged access management. Endpoint detection and response. Patch management and vulnerability management. Cyber incident response. Planning and testing. Cybersecurity awareness, training and phishing testing, hardening techniques, including RDP mitigation, logging and monitoring network protection, end-of-life systems replacement or protection, and vendor digital supply chain risk management. Well, I've read a lot of different things from a lot of carriers, and in one variation or another, most of those 12 show up as the practices that are sought or looked for by different carriers. And I'm sure many of you have read, or perhaps all of you have read too many of the cybersecurity advisories. This particular one came out from the FBI, CISA, and the NSA, and a bunch of Five Eyes nations. Here's another one from the FBI, CISA, and NSA. And, there's a high degree of overlap between those key controls or mitigation measures that they recommend and what's on the list that Marsh here proposes. My advice to real companies in the real world, where those companies are subject to 171 and CMMC, is start with this. Know you have this, because that will get you operational consequences that matter, that will make you more robust, make the workload more difficult, reduce your attractiveness to ransomware attackers, improve your ability to get, keep, and have insurance that's useful, And it will contribute to, but not necessarily solve, all of the NIST requirements for CMMC. So as you look at these 12, can anybody raise their hand and say that all of those are embedded in 171? No, you can't. Now, how about the plus 20? I didn't have time to do a slide on that. If we added the plus 20 that were removed between 1.0 and 2.0, we'd be doing better, but we still wouldn't get all these things. And this is the real world emphasis. You know, if we make ourselves the perfect showcase of 171 compliance, do we do these 12 things? Because if you don't, you are more vulnerable. And if you don't, you're less likely to get insurance. And if you don't get that insurance, your enterprise is at risk, including your government contracts compliance. All of you know that just a week or so ago, NIST announced that it is beginning to take public comments for a Rev 3 to 171. Is there anyone in this room who thinks 171 has enough in it today? No one. I don't. Is there anyone who thinks that, gee, maybe in some of these 12 areas, 171 Rev 3 ought to be improved? I think many of you would agree with that. Now, we're not sure exactly how they're going to do it, but if these are the things that the NSA and the FBI and the Five Eyes countries and CISA are urging, if these are the things that the leading carriers are urging, well, it makes sense to start to bring some of that stuff into 171 Rev 3, and it makes sense for you now to encourage and help companies to do these things, even if at the moment they are outside of what 171 requires. Let me stop for a minute and ask if anybody has any questions or derisive comments. This is a brand new presentation, so believe me, derisive comments are okay. I'll just slink off quietly. Yes? Oh, sorry, wrong way. Sorry? Well, you know, it's an interesting question. SANS top 20, I mean, I'm getting back in my history, right? The Australian top 8, if I think I'm getting your question. I mean, there's been a theory all along that why did we want all of these mechanics of 110 requirements with assessment guides that run into several hundred pages? There's always been a theory among some very smart people that if you do 8 or 12 things really well, that will really matter. And I can't say, you know, I'm not a technical guy like you. I can't say whether that's right or wrong. But the market talks. And people like Marsh are the people that are writing the policies and have to pay them. And they're the ones who are going to decide whether you are going to get insurance and what it's going to cost you and what it covers and how much you have to pay yourself and what types of risks are excluded and what are included. And all those things are going to matter a hell of a lot to every business from a small professional services company to a giant defense contractor. And if they are telling us that these are the 12 things they want to see, and they actually can tell you in much more detail what it is they want to see, well, you know, I think we have to pay attention. Because if we don't, we're letting this edifice of CMMC and assessments and certification kind of drive us from the realities of the market today and away from cognition and action upon the real threats that exist today. CMMC compliance is not a threat. It's a regulatory requirement. But ransomware is a threat. And nation-state actors, they are threats. So I want to try to bring these things together. There's potentially almost an unreality to what we do when we're just talking about CMMC. Yes, we have to do compliance. Yes, people have to be prepared. Yes, they should be ready for assessment. That's all great. But they have to be secure also. And their businesses have to be protected. Now, all of you will know the costs and consequences. And in fact, this is the one slide that I borrowed from a previous presentation to CS2. I am a lawyer. I deal in liability some of the time. I certainly deal in litigation some of the time. That's a different me, alternate personality, not here today. But I mean, this is a horrible list of things. Just look at this stuff. And this is just a short list. Okay, so your CMMC isn't perfect. Your DIBCAC high doesn't quite work. You've got your DIBCAC medium has some gaps. The first time the assessor comes in as a preview assessment, you don't quite get there, well, you got things to do. But if you actually suffer a ransomware attack, you're exposed to all of these kinds of liabilities, and the money really runs up fast. And that's why you've just got to have insurance coverage, because there's only so much that you can accomplish just by compliance, and there's only so much that you can absorb yourself. Asterisk. I do advise some companies who are very large in aerospace and defense and IT who can't get cyber insurance, or who found it so expensive that they don't try. And part of it is because the insurers look at them and they say, oh my God, what a gigantic target. If anybody actually penetrated them, the losses would be incalculable and unaffordable. Now, does that mean that they say, oh, well, that's too bad? Well, no. I mean, that means they do an even better, stronger job to protect themselves at levels far above what 171 requires. They are essentially taking the medicine, looking to their risk, mitigating it, making themselves more robust, segmenting their networks, and doing many other things. Well, in the end, some companies many ought to go that way. Well, by the way, how many of you have looked at the President's Executive Order 14028? Of course you have. And how many of you have looked at Section 3 of it? That's the one that says, gee, our federal networks are compromised. I mean, this is the executive order that SolarWinds wrote. It is, right? SolarWinds just was a shock to the system. It said, oh my God, this form of attack with persistence, intelligence, ingenuity, and agility that we never figured out has basically insinuated malware into God knows how many agencies and departments and companies, and getting it out is going to be a real problem. Now, was the answer for all those companies and the federal agencies to say, well, we're just going to take 171 type controls and we're going to make sure that we improve our premises system so that everything is great? Is that the answer in 14028? No, 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 it is not. 14028 kind of charitably and oversimplified says, we got problems. We're not sure we're going to get out of this. You know, we better think about moving our systems off the premises into the cloud in some cases. And most important, it says, perimeter-based security is not a good plan. It says we've got to get to least privilege, zero trust architecture, and it's happening. And some of the companies that I advise, some of them provide these services, and some of them are moving to do it. Is it easy, inexpensive? Is it cheap? Is it done without disruption? Of course not. But what do you get if you move from a premises-based system to a cloud-enabled zero trust architecture on a least privilege basis with your network segmented everywhere and with access conditional upon the moment and with individual user monitoring? What do you get? Well, you get a lot less vulnerability to ransomware or anything else. And in a sense, you don't care about insurance, because if your security is good enough at that level, your actual exposure is reduced. Not ever eliminated, but it's reduced. Now, how many of you are saying to your clients, as you talk to them about CMMC, you should be moving towards zero trust? Very good. Well, you know, and you should. Because as I tried to say earlier, the endpoint here is not that perfect gold star of a certification. Yes, you've got to have it when the RFP comes. The endpoint is to actually be secure against evolving threats in a world that is dangerous, where you have valuable information so that you and your board and your shareholders and your customers and your clients can actually have confidence that no matter what the hell happens, you will be there and their information will not be lost. The importance of cyber insurance. Well, you don't get it for its own. Oh, let me say what cyber insurance is not. In my Mitre work, I took a look at state and local governments, and I came to be horrified that a very large number of state and local governments got cyber insurance for the purpose, to paraphrase, of avoiding cyber responsibility. They basically said, well, shoot, if I spend $100,000 a year on cyber insurance and I got $5 million worth of coverage, then if I get breached, I got the insurance, nothing to worry about. I won't actually take the measures to make myself more secure. I'll just call the carrier and submit my claims. Well, that didn't work too well anymore. I think Fairfax School District was one of the entities that was compromised. What that shows is that even if you have cyber insurance, some of the harm doesn't go away too simply, and there can be collateral liability that goes on forever. But in any event, carriers are now reducing their willingness to cheerfully give you insurance irrespective of your security, correct? And what that tells you is that you need insurance, but it's to back you up, because the list of damages, losses, liabilities, costs, and consequences I put up earlier, that's a long and daunting list. And there are real examples in the real world of companies that have suffered cyber attacks who don't have insurance or don't have enough of it, who go out of business. So you need that. But it's not just that they pay your liability, because if you're subject to a cyber attack, you're going to be dealing with a ransomware actor and a demand, and there's all kinds of special problems that arise when. Just like that. And do you have a coach to deal with a ransomware attacker? Do you have negotiators who are skilled in dealing with the attack? I think the ratio of demand to ransomware payments is about 50%, approximately. Do you happen to be familiar with the rules of the Department of the Treasury, OFAC, FINRA, on what happens if you happen to make a payment to a prohibited party using a ransomware method? It's a per se violation. You know that stuff? What you can get are people who help with the forensics, know how to address ransomware attacker and negotiate. You can get lawyers who are supposedly skilled in this. Now, Carter Schoenberg has given me examples of where he has recommended the rejection of insurance carriers because their ransomware team isn't good enough. Can't happen. It does matter. Choice is important, because these resources are key. Now, everybody knows this a million times over. When is the worst time imaginable to begin to test your incident response plan? Don't answer. Well, okay, well, by the same token, when is the worst time ever to figure out what whether your insurance is good enough or whether your insurance team is going to help you with a ransomware attack? You really kind of like to know beforehand. And I have, many examples of where really capable teams come in and they do help a lot. Now, a separate issue altogether is whether you're going to tell law enforcement. I think you should, but not everybody does. Story for another day. So changes in the cyber insurance market. How many of you think that the federal government regulates insurers? You can't answer. It does not. There's this thing called the Federal Insurance Office in the Department of Treasury, which is more informational. Insurance companies are regulated by the states. There are 50 of them. The insurance regulations are not always the same. There are hundreds, 500 plus carriers who offer some form of cyber insurance or another. So the ones that really matter, though, may pay attention to New York, because many of them are headquartered in New York. And so the Department of Financial Services issued a very powerful and important letter, February 4th, 2021. It said the cyber insurance industry has reported that escalating costs are creating pressure to increase rates and tightening underwriting standards. Insurers that don't effectively measure the risk of their insureds are at risk of insuring organizations that use cyber insurance as a substitute for improving cybersecurity and pass costs of the insurance of the incidents to the insurer. Well, this has had very powerful effects, because this is not just the market telling insurers that they better do a better job, that they need to be smarter, stronger, and more careful before writing insurance. This is the regulator saying so, and I think it's had a very important, powerful effect. I'm going, this is the first time doing this, so I'm going more slowly than I should, so I'm going to skip this one, except to say that, from the insurer standpoint, it's not just the risk of an individual loss of a particular insured. As I mentioned or suggested earlier, a systemic risk is where somebody comes up with a method of attack that, say, Kaseya, that affects hundreds of companies. What if it's thousands? And this is where there's even some suggestions recently by the GAO that maybe the Terrorism Risk Insurance Program, TRIP, ought to be something that's extended into ransomware type insurance. I got it. And, we need that. But in the meantime, you're not concerned with the global public policy problems, but you are concerned that you have insurance for your clients or for you. Because if you are a C3PO, do you need cyber risk insurance? I think so. Now, maybe it's just going to call itself general liability or errors and omissions. But if your cyber is bad and you're a C3PO, hopefully it isn't bad, well, the carrier might decide that it doesn't really feel that you were faithful or true in the representations you made, and it might deny coverage. So I'm going to try to go through these quickly. It's worth looking at, I hope. Marsh has another another document that I've cited here. It talks about underwriting requirements, aggregation, accumulation, systematic risk, and scope of coverage. If you read these three things, they're going to explain to you why it's getting, with the higher level carriers, so intricate and complicated. Because what I've come to understand from Renee and Connor here, who work for IMA, who have been incredibly helpful to me, what I've come to understand is that this underwriting process is tailored to every individual company. And the job of the underwriter is to get as much information as they can about the risk of you as a service provider or your client, so that they can figure out what policy can be offered at which price, with what coverage, and subject to which exclusions. And these are the things that drive it. Oh, you can net all of these out and say, if you have really great security, you're going to do better. And if you have no security or just promise it, you're not going to get coverage. And if you don't have coverage, you're exposed to that long list of horrors. Renee and Connor provided me this Hartford fail-safe application. I just put in 3 of the 8 pages of questions. And every one of the questions has got a drop-down list of things, types, things, percent, amounts. And when you go through them, you go, well, that makes sense. I guess I'd want to know that too if I were writing an insurance policy. And when you go through many of them, you're going to say, wow, I mean, it's sort of like a list of requirements, say from a NIST publication, except written from the standpoint of a financial services provider. But it's really illustrative to look at that, because that's sort of, to me, the high end of the most that one of the most sophisticated insurers is going to expect. And if I'm right, and most companies really want cyber insurance, well, then you're going to want to be thinking about what they expect. And again, part of the challenge here is to weave these things you need to do for insurance and to reduce your ransomware vulnerability now into what you're going to achieve for CMMC. Don't mislead the character. I posted 10 days ago or so mention of this complaint that was filed by travelers against a company seeking to rescind the policy. Put this on LinkedIn. I think I got about 10,000 views in a few days. Well, is this really so surprising? I mean, it turns out that this particular company suffered a ransomware attack and then sought to get new coverage, and the CEO signed a form that said, I have multi-factor authentication. And then there was another attack, and it turned out that they did not. And did the carrier say, oh, well, best intentions matter? No. Carrier filed an action for rescission that said, we want a judicial declaration that we're not obliged to honor this policy. Can't take that risk. And, in the government world, this exposes you to potential liability under the False Claims Act. So any of you heard of AtBay? I know you have, it's not fair. AtBay is one of the carriers for cyber insurance, and this we haven't talked about. So I have a client who got a policy which has a signature block that says the undersigned authorized representative, CEO, CFO, CSO, says that to the best of their knowledge and belief, after reasonable inquiry, the statements set forth in the attached application are true and complete. And it says the insurer will not afford coverage to any claim arising from any fact, circumstance, situation, event, or act about which any executive officer of the applicant had knowledge prior to issuance of the proposed policy, but did not share. Now, Carter Schoenberg has said to me, and I have to rely on him as the exclusive authority, that if you are a CEO and you misrepresent the cyber credentials to get insurance, that also could affect your D&O policy, errors and omissions and the like. So there's kind of a ripple of bad consequences. So what am I trying to say here in conclusion? There's a lot of diversity in the insurance market. There are a lot of different carriers, a lot of things that they look for. They tend to converge on expecting more. But the point I want to emphasize here is that not today, but when CMMC certification is up, running, and on the ground and real, it should be a credential that you can show to the insurers, because already in that traveler's policy, there's a list of about 10 different types of assessments or certifications that they want to know. ISO, HIPAA, and the like. And and we will want the AB to work with the carriers and the insurance industry generally to make sure that when you get that CMMC certification, that it counts, as well it should, because then You are unifying your efforts to satisfy CMMC with your need to qualify for and get good insurance. And, I see this sort of chain. Your COI will be better protected. You're going to be more robust against ransomware attacks. You're going to get better and sufficient assurance. DoD's compliance objectives are served by all of this, because if you're good enough to get and keep insurance, you're actually going to do a better job at protecting their information. And those of you who are assessors and advising, you're going to be helping companies achieve all of those things. And so this is the final slide, convergence of interest. It's a sort of simple, logical chain. Ransomware is an active and dangerous threat. Everybody is at risk. In fact, I think one of the categories that is most likely to be attacked are our professional service firms, like you. Having strong cyber insurance coverage protects enterprise against grave financial injury if they are attacked. Getting insurance requires that you demonstrate now that you have good security, including recovery in the event of attack. And managing that threat and getting insurance should be aligned with CMMC compliance measures. And the bottom line is, part of the problem we have in convincing so many companies to comply with CMMC is that they are not sure that the business case is there. Putting it in colloquial terms, they don't want to spend the money. Well, I'm hoping that this kind of analysis will help close that business case, because it's not just about that compliance when the RFI or RFP comes in a year. It's about all the stuff that you're protecting yourself against and getting the benefit of right now when you take these actions. So I hope you found this interesting. I managed to have, survived the hour without being, shipped off the stage.